You're watching CTS, family-friendly television.
Hi and welcome to Rhonda London Live. On the show today, a new report on hate crimes in Toronto yielded some disturbing results. It found that the number of hate crimes investigated by Toronto police jumped 28% from 1998 to 99. Plus, B'nai B'rith recently reported that anti-Semitic incidents across Canada were up 11% in 1999 over the year before. This in a country that is home to more than 100 ethnic and linguistic groups and is world-renowned for its tolerance. Our official policy of multiculturalism is supposed to foster harmony, yet some critics say it's producing just the opposite effect. What do you think? Is the Canadian model of multiculturalism working? And is this the best tool for fighting racism? That's the focus today on the show. I want to hear your thoughts and opinions. The phone lines will be open to take your calls when we come back right after this. Is the Canadian model of multiculturalism working? My first guest today doesn't think so. He's written a provocative book called How to Kick Multiculturalism in Its Teeth. With more on this, we're joined by the book's author, Dr. Suwanda Sugunasiri. He's an executive member of the Ontario Advisory Council on Multiculturalism and Citizenship, and he teaches religion at the University of Toronto. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me over again.
Yes, we've talked to you before about this book. That certainly is provocative, How to Kick Multiculturalism in Its Teeth. Suwanda, why do we even need to kick it in its teeth?
Well, I think, I have got a lot of flack for the title itself.
Right.
Because I do talk about three dimensions about it. One is the good side of multiculturalism. The other one is the bad side, the other one is the future. So I should really say the good, bad, and the future of multiculturalism. Well, I think multiculturalism, of course, as you know, I've been quite involved with multiculturalism for 15, 20 years. So as a policy, it's an excellent, wonderful policy. But I think there have been some areas where we could do better. And I think that's the reason why I think that we need to be questioning. The kicking is a symbolic way of saying we need to question, look at it.
Okay, well, I think it's pretty self-apparent to most people what's good about our official policy of multiculturalism. What do you like about it?
Well, what I like about multiculturalism is that we have, for the first time in the human history of at a formal level, where people of different cultures, religions, languages are made to live together without fully conscious of their differences, but being able to work together. And that was the intent, but towards a common goal. And in that, my expectation and the expectation of some of the early pioneering leadership, what we call the pioneering leadership, was that we would sometimes be critical of ourselves and not ask to have everything that belongs to me, my culture, included in the multiculturalism, because that is a sure recipe for disaster, because there are often can be conflictual demands. So I think the expectation was that the people would begin to bring their differences, but develop a core value, Canadian values, as a Canadian core value system, where everybody could share. And then, so that was what I was excited about multiculturalism that we worked on in the early phases.
Would it be better to have multiculturalism as a policy paper, as an ideal, as opposed to having it as a ministry where we spend millions and billions of dollars?
Well, actually, the amount of money that we spend is very little. Less than 1% or 1%. It's not the issue is not money, but the issue is that how does it direct people in their everyday living? Now, we do need government initiative in terms of act, as you said, as an ideal for people to look up to. Do we need a ministry? At the moment, I'm not sure, but at the beginning, it definitely was needed, because people were not looking at it and taking it seriously. I remember the time when people could not even pronounce the word multiculturalism. In Ottawa, it was called multi-act. So I think it was needed. And one of the arguments I make is, now that we have launched multiculturalism, I think the governments can set back, relax and get back, let the communities take over and then do the multiculturalizing and interacting, so that the government can take a step back and then let it take a life of its own.
Well, you say you're a proponent of an idea that we have a core of Canadian values that are common to every Canadian citizen, regardless of the country of origin.
Right.
How easy, though, is it to achieve that when our culture is so elastic? It's constantly changing and evolving.
Right.
I read an interesting study that says, in the next 20, 30, 50 years, everyone is going to be the minority in this country.
Right. Already is so. Already is so.
And that's a good thing.
Yes. However, what I'm saying is this, that I think we are harping too much on our differences. After all, as human beings, we do have certain norms and values. Nobody would say that killing is good. As an example, we may look at it differently, but there are core values that all human beings share. In our different cultures, we have given interpretations in different ways in interpreting it. But I'm saying now we can question those interpretations, the ways we have looked at those issues, and look at for a core system of values. For example, who would like to be called, who would like to be seen dead drunk and beating up your wife all the time, as an example. In culture, this happens. And who would like to be told you're a liar that all the time? So I'm saying, I think we all cultural groups have recognized in the negative what you don't want to be. And I'm saying we can try to be positive. And we do share. Now, within that, we can then practice whatever we have been doing. For example, the concept of language. Language is intrinsic to the person, but only in the culture. For example, if I were born in Canada and I grew up in Germany, I would speak German. German would be as intrinsic to me as English would be if I were in Canada. So there's actually no genetic relationship between language and culture, although language and culture seem to go together. So I'm saying we have given too much attention to language, heritage language learning, for example. Now, because what that does is to separate, to divide Canadians. Rather than do the heritage language, what you need to do is support English language and French language instruction to everybody.
Well, it's certainly easy. There are something like 100 different linguistic and ethnic groups in Canada.
Exactly.
So, how could we possibly accommodate? It's more convenient, obviously, for us all to get along if we're all speaking the same language, if we're all on the same page.
I can agree with you more. That's precisely this is why I have always been against heritage language instruction. If you want to teach your language to your kid, do that at home. Same thing with religion. Now there's a coalition of religions who want public funding. My argument, I'm a Buddhist. I like to educate my children and the members of the community in Buddhism. But if I want to do that, I should do it at my cost on a private basis. Because the problem with doing it publicly is this, that you would be then teaching the sectarianism to kids. And then we are developing kids who have a particular worldview, who may even be antagonistic to another worldview. And then when they go out, that's what they go out with. And that's what they act out. And that's why it is not a good idea to give any religious funding to any system.
Well, Suwanda, our official policy of multiculturalism, which has been around for 30 years or so, the whole idea was to promote harmony. Because after all, Canada needs a high immigration level to just to survive, to sustain our population. We have negative population growth in this country. We need high immigration.
Canada has always needed.
Exactly, exactly. We're a huge country, so few people. We need all the people we can get. The idea of official multiculturalism was supposed to promote harmony. Do you think at this stage in the game that it's actually producing the opposite effect? I
do. As a matter of fact, that's why I call in my book, I talk about mutual racism, where earlier, the paradigm was that the majority white community was supposed to be discriminating against the minority communities. And then what happened was then there was what I call reverse racism, where the majority community was wronged by the minority community. Because a good example would be, recently, Christianity was not allowed in schools, the Lord's Prayer, the religion. But now I saw an article in the Toronto Star where Muslim students are allowed certain things because of religion.
Indeed.
We had told that religion should have no place in the public school system, yet here we see one religion coming but the majority religion have been wrong. They have been kept out completely. So I think, so therefore what happened, what's happening now as I see is where each community, see the term racism is used rather loosely in the Canadian context because based not on religion, not only race, but also religion, language, culture, skin color, etc.
Even gender.
Even gender, as a matter of fact. Yeah, sometimes even the challenge, handicapped, So, in the loose sense. Now, there are two meanings. One is the sense of discriminating against on the basis of something but the other one, what is ignored very much is the fact and sense of superiority, sense of superiority that people feel. Now, multicultural policy has made everybody feel, I am superior to all of you.
Right.
Okay. Now, pride.
We can't all be superior.
Exactly. I mean, all I'm saying, we can say, I am proud of my culture, but I don't have to feel that's better or superior than the other. Because the moment you say, I am superior, I lose the critical component.
Well, that is a peculiar thing about Canada, though, where you have the will of the majority bending to the minority.
Right.
And on one hand, it can be a beautiful thing, but when it's abused, it can be also very destructive.
Absolutely, and that's why I show it as a matter of fact, I have a little diagram here, where I show here in the early stages, you can say that that's the classical racist paradigm.
I'll hold it up to you.
The classical racist paradigm where you had the majority white community against the minority, the mainstream, and now they have the both ways. Here we have everybody against everybody.
Right.
And that's what's happening now. Everybody's claiming that everybody's better and superior, and everybody's trying to get a foot in the door, and in the process pushing others out. Getting in the door is fine, but we are not willing to accommodate. And the only way we can accommodate is that if we had a critical sense of criticizing yourself. For example, as a Buddhist, I would say, there's a traditional teaching that there are 24 Buddhas. I said, I don't accept that. And many Buddhists would be offended at me. Right. But unless I have that critical sense, it's very difficult to be accommodating others' viewpoints and to get along as human beings.
Okay, I want to talk to you more about that,
yes.
But first we have to take a commercial break. Also, our phones are ringing. We want to hear your thoughts on this. If you want to talk to Suwanda, our phones are open to take your calls. The number to call, 905-332-3131 or 416-203-0302. Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. We're joined in studio by Dr. Suwanda Sugunasiri, the author of How to Kick Multiculturalism in Its Teeth. Our phone lines are very busy today. We want to hear your thoughts on this. The number to call, 905-332-3131 or 416-203-0302. Let's go to Yvonne on line 7. Go ahead, Yvonne. You're on the air.
Oh, good afternoon, Rhonda. Thank you for letting me talk on television. And good afternoon, Doctor. What I'd like to say, I don't understand what multiculturalism really means. Whoever coined this word didn't include the Aboriginal Indians in the multiculturalism. They're not allowed to get jobs in any field. They're not allowed to be premiers, like we've got the Premier of BC. He's an Indo-Canadian, and the Governor General is Chinese. But these people who live in this country are not allowed to, whose country it is, are not allowed anything. And so they're really discriminated against. And I don't understand this hatred and racism. They call racism, but they are being discriminated against and not given anything. And because I've spoken out against this, people spit at me. I can understand that because in India and Pakistan, they spit at everything on the floor. In Pakistan, they would be made to take off their shirts and clean the street if they spat. I heard this. They wouldn't tolerate that nonsense, but people do spit. And they, excuse me saying this because it sounds disgusting, but it is disgusting to look at. They blow their nose on the street, but they don't use a tissue or a handkerchief.
Okay, Yvonne, I'm going to stop you there because you brought up some interesting points, and we do have a lot of callers this afternoon, and I want to fit in as many as possible. Racism has been around for as long as we've had Canada.
Well, we've had human life. We have been had racism.
Right.
There's no country in the world which have never been racism. So it's not just a Canadian problem. The only difference is that we have been bold enough to take it by the horn and then take a whack at it. So there's been racism. The caller, I think it has always been recognized, as far as I can understand, that multiculturalism includes everybody, certainly beginning with the native people. In the 1899s, at that time there were people of different cultures, and certainly some of the settlement that the government has come to with the native communities suggest that they are definitely part of multiculturalism. Can they be political leaders? I mean, that's an issue to be dealt with not by governments, but by the community itself. When they are leaders who are acceptable to the electorate, then they get elected. A good example is Assange or David Lewis, So I think Joe Geese of PEI, who was of Lebanese origin. So I don't think there's a question of conscious discrimination against the native people, but I think it's a question of they are making some leadership position and then going for the political life. Yeah.
Is part of the problem with Canada's official policy of multiculturalism is that it ends up in almost a transplantation effect. Instead of coming to Canada, embracing the country and even parts of the culture, while certainly retaining your own culture and what was beautiful, from your country of origin that you're bringing to the country. What about this transplantation effect, though, where, let's say if you're coming from Germany or Korea or China, instead of coming to Canada and becoming a Canadian, you transplant a little bit of China or Korea or Germany right in Toronto or Ottawa?
I think part of the problem was, one of the issues that I always been debated is question of what is Canadian culture. It was very difficult to identify because because there's an urban Canadian culture which is closer to the American one than the rural Canadian. Now, however, there are some traditional Canadian values of tolerance, and not all of us bring that tolerance to this country. So there are, you can identify some Canadian values, more conservative than the Americans in terms of political ideology, probably more compassionate. So we can identify. And I think that, and that's exactly my point too, that when we bring our culture, we cannot bring it lock, stock and barrel, the whole thing, and expect everything to be accepted. I have an antidote. I say, if anybody from another culture who are not born in this culture come and demand something here, I won't tell that person, okay, fine, I will agree to do it in Canada, provided you work on your government to accept the same value in your country.
Right.
And then I'm willing to consider it in Canada. Otherwise, don't come and ask for the heaven and the sky and the moon, because I think there's an obligation. Because what's missing in the multicultural paradigm is an obligation dimension. Everybody expects rights.
Right.
But nobody seems to think that we have obligations toward them. In other words, if I ask for certain things for my, quote, culture, obviously you have to give. And if I'm compassionate, I have to be compassionate enough to make sure that my getting does not impinge on your giving.
Well, you see, that's the thing, too, because some things are absolutely mutually exclusive. Sometimes you can't accommodate, for instance, the issue that you brought up in our last segment about the Our Father being taken out of the public schools. Such a controversial issue. And, that issue had, it had been attempted to address that issue before by accommodating everybody's religious beliefs within the context of the public school system. Well, that doesn't work because religious worship experience, it's often mutually exclusive. There are very few religious paradigms where you can embrace and participate in other religions.
But you see, the issue of the schools is somewhat different because, you see, we have a policy in Canada where the school and the state and the church is supposed to be separated. The school being an institution of the state, religion cannot. You can have prayer service, service, but then to accommodate beyond that is to bring in religion into to the school, which is going to be quite dangerous. And I think that's the reason why it can be accommodated. It can be mutually. Not only is that, it can be also destructive. It can be it can affect the program, the day's programs. And another argument was that the boys and the girls are supposed to be separated. I mean, that runs right against our thinking in the Canadian milieu, or the thing of many other religions as well. So to accommodate one religion means that we have to change everything to to meet the needs of a minority community. And I think that's where the danger has been.
We've got time for one more phone call before we go to commercial break. Let's go to Steve on line 1. Go ahead, Steve. You're on the air.
Hello.
Hi, Steve. Go ahead. You're on the air.
You know what? I am in complete agreement with your guest. Let's kick multiculturalism right in the teeth. I have no problem whatsoever with multiculturalism and everybody enjoying and celebrating their heritage. But taxpayer-funded multiculturalism must end. Absolutely has to. If a culture is alive and vital, it is, because it is alive and vital on its own merits, and it doesn't need to have the artificial support and resources of government to force it along. I spent a lot of time.
Steve, I'm going to stop you there. You've brought up made an excellent point. And you have to wonder, too, how much it really helps, you know, on Canada Day to have some Highland dancers performing down at the Parliament buildings. How much does that really do to foster harmony or acceptance of other cultures? I don't know. Well, it's certainly nice to watch and participate and enjoy.
Yeah,
but
I think on a day like, because I'm a member of the Canada Day Committee, I think it's good to see different cultures coming in. But there's an amount of money involved. I think we have to make it very clear that even today, even at that time, there was not a lot of public money going into it. There was some money, and I've argued that even that should be cut off. I think that as this speaker Steve was talking about, I think the community should take on the responsibility, because after all, the communities are not poor anymore. They were not like the time, you know, in 56 or 71 when multiculturalism was introduced. These minority communities were poor. Now they are professionals, and their organizations, and you know they're well to do. So we have to put them and say, okay, if your culture is valuable, fine, put some money into it and show us. And then, and also I think one of the important things that we need to do is to say, if the government does want to intervene, what it need to do is to set up intercultural councils, not multicultural, where people come together and talk about what are the common areas, common values that we as Canadians can cherish and nurture and live by. And I think that would be the way I would like to go.
Well, if people would like to get a hold of how to kick multiculturalism in its teeth, here's how they can do that. The Village Publishing House puts it out. It's Box 38138, Castlewood Outlet, Toronto, Ontario, M5N 3A8, and the phone number is 416-487-7793, or if you want to send a fax, it's 416-487-2777. Suwanda, thank you so much for joining us today on the show. It's always delightful talking to you.
Indeed, the pleasure is mine.
Don't go away. We're going to continue this conversation on multiculturalism. The Canadian model, is it working? Is it effective? We want to hear your thoughts. We want to take as many phone calls as we possibly can, and we're back right after this. Is Canada's model of multiculturalism the best weapon for fighting racism? Is multiculturalism working, or are some changes needed? With her thoughts on all of this, we're joined by Moy Tam. She's the Executive Director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. Moy, thank you so much for joining us.
It's good to be here.
How do you feel about Canada's model of multiculturalism? Do you feel it's working?
I think Canada is one of the only countries in the world to have an official Multiculturalism Act. Australia actually took the model of the Canadian Multiculturalism Act and did likewise. And it has shown in the last a little over 2 decades of Multiculturalism Act being in effect that we have done better than the United States, for example. In terms of naturalization, that means immigrants coming to Canada who want to become Canadians, who want to belong and take out Canadian citizenship. So we have a much higher rate of naturalization in Canada. And also the number of people, or the percentage of Canadians who agree with the statement that people of different ethnic backgrounds are getting along is a lot higher in Canada than in the US as well. And lastly, the rate of approval for interracial marriages is also higher, meaning people are accepting the differences in the ethnic and racial backgrounds.
Well, as Dr. Sugunasiri maintains, this policy of multiculturalism at this point in the game, instead of bringing us all together and creating harmony, it's actually accentuating the divisions and the differences.
I think in any society where you have changes in population, there is bound to be adjustments that have to be made. I always feel that it's analogous to having guests in your house. You have to bend your house rules a little bit to accommodate your guests. And of course, as polite guests, they will have to respect your house rules. But there is give and take. It is a two-way street. And of course, people who have immigrated to Canada don't remain as guests forever. They want to belong. They participate also quite highly in the political arena. As you can see, we've seen the first Indo-Canadian premier elected in BC.
Right.
So things are changing, and they are quite involved in the mainstream politics. And they do not set out their own ethnic political parties, but they're all mainstream Canadian political parties. So in terms of integration, I think they have, the Multiculturalism Act has certainly helped in terms of immigrants participating in the social, economic, and political life of Canada.
So you think the cultural mosaic works much better than the American melting pot?
I really think that the evidence support that Canada has done much better than the United States, because for an immigrant to integrate, it takes a generation or two, and that's very fast. Aside from the elderly, we have an extremely high language acquisition rate among immigrants. A survey shows that something like 98 or 99% of Canadians speak either English or French. So language acquisition has also been very, very high, because everybody who wants to work will find that they need to have language facility in order to have a broad range of choices. Let's not forget the Multiculturalism Act actually is set within the context of the larger bilingualism policy. So it is within the English and the French language policy that the Multiculturalism Act is set. It's a much smaller program than the other ones, because we still have the economic and employment factors, and there is a lot of pressure there, whether it's legislative or otherwise, for people to want to acquire one of the two official languages in order to get ahead in their employment or in education.
Well, our phones are very busy. Let's go to Judy on line 5. Go ahead, Judy. You're on the air.
Hi.
Hi, Judy. Go ahead.
Mackenzie King warned against opening the floodgates of immigration. He said it would be too great of a cultural shock, and I think that's what our country has gone through in the last 20, maybe 30 years.
Okay, Judy, you bring up a good point, but here's the problem, and I don't think, a lot of people are not cognizant of this. To survive economically, Canada, it's not just for altruistic reasons that Canada has a high immigration policy. As a matter of fact, it is very motivated by self-interest. We need to have this high level. As a matter of fact, we should double or even triple our level of immigration if we want to be economically viable.
That is so true, because if you look back in history, we have Europeans brought in, we have many Ukrainian immigrants brought in to open up the prairies. And then you had Chinese railroad builders brought in to build the Canadian Pacific Railroad and unite this country. So different waves of immigrants have served their different purposes. And Canada is constantly looking for more immigrants to sustain our economic viability. Aside from the fact that we have a population decline without immigration, we are also looking at an increasingly global economy. Without the global, without the immigrants that we have in Canada, without the different cultural and linguistic skills that they bring with them, it would be difficult for Canada to trade with all the different regions of the world. So what some people may see as a problem is actually an advantage for Canada in terms of global trade. And we must not forget the immigration level right now is lower than 1% of Canadian population. It's less than 1%. But of course it is more concentrated in urban cities. But then Canada is also increasingly becoming a more urban country. People are gravitating towards larger centers.
Yeah, you can never overlook the fact that our immigration policy is motivated solely by self-interest, so that's important to know. We have to take a commercial break. Our phone lines are open. We want to take as many phone calls as possible today. The number to call 905-332-3131 or 416-203-0302. Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. The question we're asking today is multiculturalism, the Canadian model of multiculturalism. Is it working or is there room for improvement? Let's go to Kay on line 7. Go ahead, Kay. You're on the air.
Hello. Good afternoon. I'm enjoying your program. I am, however, really upset about the things the doctor was saying. I do not agree with what he said at all. I mean, as a country, we would not be where we are today in terms of multiculturalism if we did not have the policies in place or a ministry to make sure those policies were carried out. People don't usually do things if they cannot see a vested interest in it for themselves unless they're forced to, which is why we have the policies and the ministry. Generally speaking, I mean, these policies make sure that people are treated with respect, not just the majority. And in terms of something else he had said about the Aboriginal people, the reason why the Aboriginal people aren't where they are today is for the simple fact that there have been barrier upon barrier upon barrier placed in their way. We know that beyond education, employment is one of the ways that you can increase your political power within the community. And things like employment equity were canceled. So Aboriginals have a hard time finding employment. There are barriers placed in their way for education, partly because of the language too. But again, Aboriginal language is not our official language, it's French. So here we go again. So I really believe that people need to look beyond their own interest to other people, and we are a brother's keeper, and we really need to be cognizant of that as we go about living our lives.
Okay, Kay, thank you so much for your phone call. Moy, I'll let you respond to that.
I agree with what the caller has said. The Aboriginal people were the original inhabitants of this land, and they actually view everybody who came afterwards as immigrants, including people from the UK 200 years ago or from France. So I think it's a very relative term, whether you're an immigrant or not. It really comes down to who got here first and who came here later. I think the key thing to bear in mind is that I think Canadians do share this value that we want to treat each individual with dignity and value them as individuals. There is a basic recognition for the human dignity and
what
equality.
do you see as the motivation behind racism? Is it fear or is it hatred or sometimes a mixture of both?
I like to think that it is based on ignorance. I think in most cases it is based on ignorance and fear of the unknown. That's why it's important that people get to know the cultures that are brought by other groups. That's why it's important to have some official act in place to support some of the programs. Mind you, most of the funds in multiculturalism program is geared toward identity and civic participation to integrate immigrants, because it does take a generation to integrate new immigrants. However, they're free to choose to retain some parts of their heritage if they choose to, because as human beings, I think there is a need to cling on to some of your heritages, and that makes a more secure person and who's more able to participate in the new country that they have found. And immigrants love Canada fervently. They are the people most enthusiastic about waving the flags and so on.
Well, think about it. They chose to come here, whereas, for many Canadians, myself included, I was born here. I didn't get to choose Canada.
Right. I think people who chose Canada value Canada extremely because they've made this very conscious decision to come here, and they want it to be a better country and contributing in different ways and bringing with them some of the cultures. And just like biodiversity, ethnic diversity can be enriching, and it gives you more tools to face the new millennium.
Moy Tam, our time is gone, but I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Don't go away. We're going to continue this conversation on multiculturalism. We're going to try to take as many phone calls as possible, although our lines are very busy today. We'll be back with more Rhonda London Live after this. Is multiculturalism in Canada working? That's the question we're asking today. Joining our conversation, Paul McKeever. He's a lawyer and a member of both the Reform Party and the Freedom Party of Ontario. Thank you so much for joining us, Paul.
Thank you.
How do you feel about our policy of official multiculturalism? Do you feel it's a workable model?
Well, I think you have to distinguish between multiculturalism, the idea, which is where Canadians get along well with everybody else, independently of their culture or their nationality, etc., which I think is a beautiful and actually necessary idea in Canada. And then the federal legislation, which is about funding various initiatives. If you look at the kind of initiatives that are funded, well, really any of them, they tend to focus on the racism issue, in other words, breaking down racism. But if you look at the Act itself, it also says that part of the policies in Canada are about sustaining or preserving as many cultures as may enter Canada. In other words, we want to have a virtual museum of culture in Canada, and I think that's misguided. I think when the professor came out earlier, he was talking about how at first multiculturalism was needed, and I think that's a debatable point, but he said that now it's gotten to the point where individuals, groups can more or less promote their cultures for themselves. And I think Canada has now become so multicultural, just as on the population basis, that's true. I don't know that we need federal funding for that kind of thing.
Do you think the danger is that multiculturalism has brought us to the point now, and our culture is very elastic, it's changing, because of our high immigration levels, our population, our demographics, Canada is constantly in a state of change. Our official policy of multiculturalism, some would argue that it has not really kept up, and as a matter of fact, we're at the point now where instead of promoting harmony, it's actually promoting divisions, and it's creating racism, the very thing that it was designed to combat in the first place.
Well, I think it's important to identify what is the policy we're talking about, what is creating the divisions. I don't think that
the preservation of individual cultures within Canada.
Yeah, I think
the transplantation effect that I talked about at the top of the show,
right,
where you transplant a little piece of Korea or China or Germany in Canada.
Yeah, I think immigration and all the cultural richness that comes with that is not something that's in any way destructive to Canadian culture or whatever you want to call it, to Canada. What may be divisive is someone on high deciding, well, we're going to throw money at this particular culture or that particular culture because it's necessary to preserve it. I think that, especially when you look at the small amount of money that the ministry is doling out, I think Ms. Tam was saying something in the order of $20 million, it starts to look more like a political slush fund than anything that's actually doing something useful. I mean, you have to be careful not to give too much credit to the federal multiculturalism policy for creating the tolerance that exists now. I think largely that's a function of the fact that we've had more cultural diversity over the last 30 years since that act was brought in. And we have a film industry, for example, that's much more tolerant of different cultural styles and et cetera. I think Canada's just becoming naturally more rich through the immigration and business process.
Well, the policy itself then, if that's not what you have a problem with, it's spending money on it.
That's right. I mean, we've got a relatively small amount.
Have a policy paper, have that as a mindset, a political mindset, but why spend any money on it?
Exactly. I mean, why should one culture feel like they're being left out when another is getting a piece of the pie? And undoubtedly, the pie is going to be divided according to political need on the part of the person giving out the money. It's not really going to be a fund that's large enough to in any way enhance or preserve any culture at all. You also have to ask yourself, what is the sense in preserving a culture that can't sustain itself? I mean, it's only as valuable as the people who are participating in it.
Well, critics would say it's such a small amount of money.
That's right, which is what makes it more suspicious. I mean, if we had a true dedication to this idea of the cultural museum, where we want to have numerous 30, 40, 50 different cultures all well represented in Canada, and regular commercials and festivals and et cetera, or maybe different councils set up to promote the various cultures, you'd think that they'd want to dedicate a lot more than $20 million to it. It really smacks of more a political decision than anything else.
Although that is one of my pet peeves. When we're talking about government dollars, I love the way we throw only in front of any figure.
That's right. I mean,
$20 million? I don't know about you, Paul, but I don't have $20 million in the bank. That's a lot of money to me.
That's right. I mean, and especially when you're trying to pay, daycare. I think my daycare bill this year is going to be $20,000. daycare alone, and that's after tax dollars. And the tax cuts they're handing out for those aren't exactly huge. So $20 million is a lot of money. And to say only at the beginning of it is almost insulting to the taxpayer of Canada, I think. I think you're right.
Okay. Well, our phones are very busy. Let's go to Louise on line 8. Go ahead, Louise. You're on the air.
Hi. My opinion about multiculturalism is it's gone too far. They're eroding the basic Christian values that we established back when Christopher Columbus came here and discovered this Western civilization. And they established Christian colonies. And this holiday tree business and all this money going into multiculturalism, are we cutting our own throats, really? I think that money that's going into multiculturalism, $20 million you said, should be going into daycare so we can reproduce and stay home and look after our children as it used to be and live normal instead of having all these immigrants flush in and all this static between people with this bigotry or whatever, because I'm not prejudiced, but I find that a lot of these immigrants are prejudiced.
Okay, well, Louise, something that we do need to point out, with the exception of the Aboriginal people, although the argument could be made that they're immigrants as well, we're all immigrants.
Yeah, I think that point has to be made. I don't think it's a valid argument that we're, by immigration, somehow losing something. I think we're, in fact, gaining something. And to say that we're losing a Christian culture is simply to say that culture is changing. In fact, Christian culture, it could be argued, is changing even within the community of people who used to be Christian, who may now have changed their religion or maybe have, for some reason, lost religion altogether. I don't think those people have become somehow worthless to society. In fact, some of them contribute in their own ways by the new philosophies they adopt. So I wouldn't want to go down that road.
Okay. Let's go to Rainey on line 7. Go ahead, Rainey. You'll have to make it quick, though. We're running out of time.
Hello.
Hi, Rainey. Go ahead. You're on the air.
Oh, I was just the topic I want to talk to you. You just said it about the religion. Mm-hmm. That's what I meant. That's what I wanted to talk about. But the lady did a good job of it.
Okay, so Rainey, you feel that the Christian culture that Canada was founded on has been eroded by our high immigration policy?
Definitely by the news, but by the Muslim, what they're killing all the other peoples in Africa and everything. They are even our prayer from the school, they try to take it out.
Okay, Rainey, thank you very much for your phone call. Thank you for your input. You know, a lot of Canadians feel that way. Where does that sense of loss come from? Because the economic reality is we need immigration to be economically viable.
Right.
It is, our immigration policy is motivated by self-interest. Like, make no mistake about that. Yeah. But where does this fear and this sense of loss come from?
Well, the fear and the sense of loss, in my view, I mean, I used to be in a university setting where there were too few offices for all of the people that wanted them. And so there was all kinds of fear and backstabbing and et cetera there. When resources are limited, there will be fear of loss. And you're never going to be living in a situation where resources are unlimited. So when newcomers come and they want your office, naturally the feeling is, find your own office, this is mine. And I think that's where that kind of ugly feeling is coming from.
Yeah, we have a lot of office space in Canada. It's a huge country. We have to take a commercial break, but don't go away. We'll be back with more Rhonda London Live right after these messages. Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. Today we've been talking about multiculturalism. Paul, we are running short on time. We just have 2 minutes left of the show. There just seems so much ground that we need to cover here today. And there just seems to be, from the calls that we've had today, there really seems to be a feeling among many of the people, and certainly this is not scientific by any stretch of the imagination, the number of people who called in the show, but there seems to be a feeling that our model of multiculturalism somehow is not working.
Yeah, well, I think that's because, as we were saying here on the break, you get a sense of loss when you get a sense of change, or when you get a sense that other people are coming in to share an existing size of pre-existing size of pie. But I think if you just sit down and ask yourself, you know, do I want to treat these people any differently than I would want the government to treat myself? I think you can calm a lot of your own fears, a lot of your own tensions about this kind of thing. And I think you do have to keep in mind that unless Canada does become more culturally diverse and bigger, then we are going to have problems at the international level. We'll be a bunch of you know, inward-looking, fearful protectionists.
Well, isn't that more of a reason then we should be spending money on this?
I don't think so. I think that will naturally happen. In fact, I think if you get people out of the mindset where government's going to be providing them with some kind of welfare, and I'm not saying the welfare program, I'm talking about more generally handouts, then people become less dependent on government handouts. They will say, well, that's not what government's all about. Government's there to protect me and my right to diversity, my property, and etc. And so it doesn't matter how many people come in, how different they are, because there's no pie to be divided. All we're doing is sharing a safe zone of diversity.
So you would rather talk about individual rights instead of group rights?
Absolutely.
There shouldn't be Aboriginal rights or women's rights, or we should talk about individual rights?
Aboriginal rights is certainly a whole new can of worms, so I could avoid that. But I could certainly say that I don't think we should be in any way granting anybody a special right, privilege, or chunk of cash, for that matter, because their skin is of a certain color, their religion's of a certain type, or their nationality is different.
Do you think that's a form of racism?
Yes, I do.
Reverse?
Well, there is no reverse racism, really. Racism is racism. And when you prefer one person over another, that's racism.
Okay, Paul McKeever, thank you so much for joining us. It's always nice talking to you.
Thank you.
Well, that's our show for today. Thanks so much for watching. You can't miss tomorrow's show, especially if you've ever wondered what you're eating at the grocery store. So-called Frankenstein foods are all over Canadian shelves, but is it healthy? We'll take a look at the latest issues. That's tomorrow.
You're watching CTS, family-friendly television.